Good morning. Well, Dr. Heinz Lycklama earned a bachelor's degree in engineering physics and a PhD in experimental nuclear physics from McMaster University in Canada. Since then, he has worked in the telecommunications and computer software industries at Bell Telephone Laboratories in New Jersey and at Interactive Systems Corporation in California as an individual contributor and in management positions. In 1992, Dr. Lycklama formed Open Systems Technology Associates to offer his technology management consulting services to various startups in high technology industry. In 2013, Heinz founded the Apologetics Forum of Snohomish County to help equip believers in the defense of the faith. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Heinz Lycklama.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Of course, there's a lot more to me than just that as well. My wife is in the back row there, and she'll be critiquing my presentation afterwards. But and she's been a very strong supporter of what we do in apologetics. I've had the privilege of working in the high-tech industry despite my degree in nuclear physics. And so I've a rather broad experience of a lot of technologies, and I've taught through many books of the Bible. And so as I entered my retirement years, I figured I need to bring those two together because the Bible really is supported by science. I mean, true science really is consistent with what God says in His Word, and what we see in His creation. They really do match. And so that's been my challenge, and that's why one of the reasons I started the Apologetics Forum up there. We bring in speakers as well as you do here. I've been here a number of years ago as well, speaking at this one, and I do speak at other venues. But today, you've asked me to speak on climate change, global warming. There's a lot in the news about that, and so I'm going to go through. There is more information on my slides here than I can possibly go through in the time we have, so I'll be skipping through some, but I'm going to hit the highlights of it. And this evening, I'm going to be speaking at the Mount St. Helens Creation Center, and I'm going to give a different emphasis on that talk, but it's the same title. So anyway, my title here is, Do We Have a Climate Crisis? Is it really a problem? Do we know what's going on? So I'm going to walk through some of these topics here. I'm not going to read all these words. You can get an idea of what we're going to cover. The UN IPCC, of course, is the governmental organization that promotes climate change, and it promotes it as a crisis. And then there's another organization that was started up a little later, and that's the NIPCC, and that's the Nongovernmental Panel on Climate. And then what I'm going to spend time on is consideration of 16 key issues that we need to be aware of. And then finally, after the break, probably we'll get into talking about the benefits and warming about CO2. And there's another organization, the CO2 Coalition, which talks about the benefits of warming and some other issues. And then I end up by saying, what are the experts saying? I'm saying one thing. I'm a scientist. I've looked at this. When I started to look at this issue back in 2009, actually, just when this was getting to be a controversy, I wanted to understand why it was a controversy. And after about 3 or 4 months looking at that, I looked at the observations, what the measurements say, and I looked at the models that they were using in the UN IPCC. And as a scientist, I came to the conclusion very quickly, if the observations don't match the theory, you better change your theory until they match. And so they're still working on that, as you'll see as we look at the conclusion. I'm going to name some experts in the field. To me, this is a sidelight, but these are the guys that have really studied the issue in detail. Okay, and then we'll make some conclusions. So first of all, biblical mandate. You're certainly familiar with this verse, Genesis 1:28. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves. And then secondly, God promises that while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. In other words, the seasons are not going to go away. We're going to have them, okay? And as a scientist, what my motive is to test everything that we're told. Is it true or is it not? Okay, here are some of the claims that have been made by the UN IPCC. Many of you will be familiar with this. So they're going to look at climate change, and we note that global warming is happening at a very fast rate. So what's behind all this? And they claim that's largely due to increased burning of fossil fuels. It's serious. We need to cut back on CO2 released in the atmosphere. There's representatives of 190 nations. Most of the nations in the world, they meet annually to discuss these issues. They've issued 6 reports over the last 30 years. Another one is coming out. And then the claims that the UN IPCC makes have been refuted by this other organization, the NIPCC, and also a new one that started in 2015, and that's the CO2 Coalition. So here are some of the man-made claims. These are predicted by the IPCC. The global warming is real. It's human cause. If we don't do anything, we're going to be on the average of average global temperature 5 degrees higher by 2100 at the end of this century. So the Arctic ice cap is disappearing. Sea level will rise by 88 centimeters in 2100. Increased drought, extreme weather, more storms, heat waves, more wildfires, most significant mankind threat. We have to act now. So then we ask the question, what's the reality of this? Well, you might, I think most people here will remember back in the 70s when there was a warning about global cooling. The world is really cooling. So we better do something about this. And that was emphasized by the governor at the time, Governor Jerry Brown, and also some notable scientists like John Holdren and Paul Ehrlich, and of course the real scientist Al Gore had a lot to say about this. So in the 70s, and we were living in Canada at the time. We had huge snow banks to go through, and so it really was colder back then. And now the warning is global warming. Started about 25, 30 years ago. And who warned us about that? Well, the same governor. So then global warming, which is it? So Governor Jerry Brown talked about this and warned us about this. It's in the headlines of the newspapers, and he warned California facing an unprecedented drought, blamed it on global cooling at the time, back in the 70s. And of course, this guy, back in 2008, he warned us that the cap, the Arctic, would disappear in 5 years, 2013. Anybody see the ice up there? Still there. Okay, so a little bit about what we're talking about. Obviously all of our energy comes from the sun, and it comes down into our atmosphere. Some of that energy is reflected back out into space by clouds and the surface of the Earth. And note that it's 30% of the sun's rays are reflected back up through into the atmosphere, back in the atmosphere and into space. And then the issue is the other 70% is absorbed by the Earth's surface and atmosphere and converted to heat and emitted as invisible infrared rays. So that's the big picture, and that's what they call the greenhouse effect. This is done by greenhouse gases. Okay, what are these greenhouse gases? Well, according to the UN IPCC, it starts at carbon dioxide, which is 3.6% of all the greenhouse gases. And then we have methane, which is a factor of 10 less than even of CO2. And then nitrous oxide, which is important for fertilizers, etc. And then other miscellaneous CFCs. So the emphasis, they talk about CO2. Well, what about water vapor, clouds? That actually is 95%, of all the greenhouse gases by volume. And then you could break it down further into what's natural. In other words, if man was not on this earth, and man is on this earth, so we are creating some of these greenhouse gases. But the big part of that is 95%, almost all of it. I mean, we don't control the water vapor or the clouds. I mean, that's natural, forces doing that. So man has only 0.001% of that. Now you come to carbon dioxide, and it's 0.117% of this 3.6, which is the other is natural. So if you go and add all these up, you come down to the fact that the causes of warming that are due to man is 0.28% of the volume of all the gases, the greenhouse gases. So these are the 5 greenhouse gases. The UN focuses on CO2, and people that speak against that and see the problems with that realize that they're missing water vapor, because that is the big controller of energy back and forth. And this is just another way of looking at it. You got the natural, which is the gray, and you got those percentages, which I mentioned before. Carbon dioxide, man-made, is 3% of all the natural CO2. So we're just a small part of the emitting, causing the emitting of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So now I'm going to walk through some of these issues, the 16 issues, and I'll start with climate is always changing. You may have not seen a picture like this before, and it's approximate, but this goes all the way back to 2200 BC and to today's date, and you'll see that the average temperature of the Earth has fluctuated from warm to cold, cooler sometimes a deeper cold. And back in the 1600s, we had what we call the Little Ice Age, where it really got cold for a long time. And now we are part of this. We are indeed warming, coming out of that. But that's not anything to be concerned about, because we've been through that before. These temperatures, of course, they didn't have the thermometer back then, but they can look at ice cores and other things to make a guess at what the temperatures were, and this is pretty close. So the point is, climate has always been changing. It's never stable. Number 2, people don't realize that CO2 is required for life. If we didn't have CO2 in the atmosphere, we as human beings would not be here. Plants would not be here, okay? And you'll note sometimes they call CO2 a pollutant. Well, no. It is real CO2 is not a pollutant. There are other gases which are emitted from our cars which are pollutants, but it's not the CO2. And as you'll see later on, the CO2 increases food production, okay? And if you look at the emissions from these plants here, and even humans do emit some carbon dioxide. We do, but how much? Not very much compared to these big plants here. And here's one that scientists have measured. We are today at about 420 parts per million in the atmosphere of CO2. Now, and you can control it in a greenhouse, and if you did, like this scientist did, here's the one at 385 parts per million, and here's the size of the tree, and then you keep on adding more and more carbon into the greenhouse, and you do get taller trees. So carbon dioxide is needed, to grow food. So number 3, and this is a big one, science is not settled. Okay, if you look at predictions made by like Paul Ehrlich, and particularly John Holdren, whose name was in the other list with Gore, he was actually Obama's science advisor. And so he made one warning back in the 70s about a cooling Earth, and then later on, you'll see he came in the 2000 or 1995, warned us about global warming. So these predictions made in the 1980s about global cooling, all of that came to naught. The UN, and then about global warming, the UN overestimated global warming, and all rainforest spirits will be extinct. Oil will run out of oil. Now, these were made way back in the 80s. We're far from running out of oil. The Arctic sea ice will disappear, and we see that hasn't happened. And people could die from climate change. In fact, these people, Holdren and others, or Ehrlich, were projecting that we would lose billions of people. And of course, this is not an issue. So Holdren again, 1971. And I'm not going to read these, but these are actual pronouncements made by Gore and others. None of them came true. All of the projections that Gore made, they're all false prophecies. They never happened. And we're going to look at the changing warming and cooling over from 1880 to 2000 and more. The blue line here, that is the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and the red line is the solar activity. So you can see here that the temperature, and this is a measure of that, actually agrees a lot about solar activity. And the UN, of course, says that the more carbon dioxide you put into the air, the temperature should just gradually keep on going up. But guess what? There's a period of time where it did not go up, even though the amount of carbon in the atmosphere was. Okay, we've had warm periods in the past. The Roman warm period, the medieval warm period when Greenland was green and Iceland was ice. Modern warm, and we have a modern warming period now, but it's nothing like the medieval or the Roman. And you might have heard of this guy, Michael Mann, a scientist, a scientist who showed you this curve of the average temperature went from 1000 AD to 2000, and they showed a very steep rise here after the 1850 or so. And he said, look, we're in trouble. That's a steep, steep rise. But what did we actually have? According to Tim Ball, who is a Canadian climate scientist from way back, he has since passed, but he studied this stuff for 50 years, was well known. Here's the curve that he showed. There was a warm period. This is the medieval, and then we had some cooler periods, and now we are warming a bit, but nothing like back here. Okay, then we have this other organization, the non-governmental, which consists of scientists and scholars who are not paid by the government, so they're not biased in what they're doing here. They have peer-reviewed technical papers, they hold conferences, they publish these 4 reports, and they're available on the internet. And their conclusion was that nature, not human activity, rules the climate. Okay, totally different from what the UN IPCC is telling us. And so they critique the IPCC's summary reports, and then they wrote a number of books on why scientists disagree about global warming. Okay, another one, issue number 4, CO2 cannot drive global warming. And I shouldn't say cannot. It does not drive global warming as much as the UN IPCC says it does. And here's the 4 major possible global warming causes. With increased CO2 in the atmosphere, there's not enough coming into the atmosphere to make a whole lot of difference. The second one is the influence of sunspots. Sunspots that go through 11-year cycles, and the distance of the Earth from the sun, and the sun cycles, and difference in the sun's surface. It has very violent changes as well. Other scientists say this is very likely one of the major causes, not the sun itself, but the solar irradiance. The solar irradiance that has an effect on the cloud cover. In fact, some of you may remember Dr. Larry Vardaman of ICR. That was his conclusion, and I've talked to him about this a number of times. Of course, he's no longer active in this, but that is one of the big causes. The cloud cover has more to do with the controlling the temperature than the CO2. And then the interaction between some cosmic rays as well. And then the 4th major charge is that of oscillations in the oceans. Oceans cover 70% of the world. And this helps to moderate the average temperature in the world because, as the Earth rotates and parts of the Earth are not warmed by the sun, the reason why we can have life on Earth is because it does rotate. It cools slightly during the night, but not remarkably. And we're very comfortable during the night. So there are cycles of oscillation within the oceans that have a major effect on climate. Okay, here, how much carbon dioxide do we have? Well, scientists have measured that on a mountain there's an observatory that measures the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And indeed, from 1960 at the bottom here to 2020, the red one is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And indeed, it is increasing. It has gone from 320 parts per million up to 420. Okay, and we are approaching 430 parts per million now. So that's quite a change. Okay, 50% change or so. So that's the red line. The blue line is the average temperature of the world. Now, if carbon dioxide were the major determinant of the temperature on the Earth, the average temperature, then the blue line should track this very, very closely. But it doesn't. You'll notice here there's a negative correlation in the first part from 1960 to 1975 and 80. And you will remember that was the cooling period. Okay, so why is that coming down? Why didn't it just follow the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? And then we have here, there's a good correlation from 1977 or so up to about a little over 2000. So very closely correlated, but then it leveled off for 20, 25 years while the CO2 still kept rising. So there is not a close correlation between the two, as the UN would have you believe. The other thing that we need to recognize about the CO2 in the atmosphere, I mean, it is very insignificant. 420 parts per million. That's where we are now. But the things I want to point out is that with no carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the first 20 parts per million that you add has a big impact on the temperature, but the next 20 has a much smaller impact on the average temperature, and so on as you add more and more carbon dioxide, carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The temperature does not go up a whole lot, so it's declining. The CO2 is saturating, in the atmosphere at these levels. There are some markings here. We need at least 180 or 60 parts per million for plants to grow. If it was lower than that, plants couldn't grow. So we are well above that. The pre-industrial level is the around the 1800s, when the industrial levels became very active, and then but even then the amount of carbon dioxide being added is very small. Okay, and then I'm not going to go into this very much here, but this is a measure. Scientists have equations that measure the amount of radiation and how it impacts the average temperature. The thing you need to recognize here, if the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is zero, there's nothing, there's a pretty well-defined curve here which shows you how much radiation, how much is reflected and how much is admitted up into the atmosphere. And so there's the peak over the frequency range here. But if you have 400 parts per million, that's the black, you'll see this curve is here. There's a dip here. And then if you were projected to go up to 800 parts per million, there's hardly any change at all. So the more CO2 you add to the atmosphere from now on is not going to have a huge impact on the atmosphere or on the average temperature. Okay, and I'm going to skip through these. This here shows a warming impact, okay, from CO2. The more parts per million you have, the less the temperature grows. Okay, and here's a very important one. This is a projection of dependence on sunspots. 400 years of sunspot observations. You'll notice back in the 1650, we had a very low period from 50 to 1700, even to 1750. And then the number of sunspots, the strength of the sunspots increased again. And this lines up perfectly with the little ice age that I said started in the 1600s. And so from then till now, we have had a lot of sun cycles go up and down, 11-year cycles. And now some scientists would say that we are approaching another minimum, the modern minimum. So we may actually be on the start of a cooling period. Now, there's a lot of science behind that, and not everybody agrees with that, but that's what one of the government agencies said. In fact, NASA predicted that there would be another low cycle sunspot, starting in it's number 2025. So we may be at the start of that, but we'll see. Okay, then I come to number 6, which is the Pacific Oceans, the PDOs, the Pacific Decadal Oscillations. There is major oscillations in the contributions of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and from 1900 to over to 2020 or so, you'll see that the red is a positive warming. So if the oceans are letting off a lot of carbon dioxide, it does warm. And then if there's a shift to cold, then it cools off a bit. And now we have just been in, from 1980 till now, this matches the what we have observed. And note also, in the past, before 1979, temperature measurements were done by thermometers because the science was well understood. But in 1979, they start to use satellites we have satellites up there. They can measure the temperature much more accurately than we can with thermometers. Okay. So the full implementation of the Paris Climate Agreement would almost have no effect on climate, even by 2100. And this was a big thing back in 2015. And the Paris Climate Agreement, when all the nations agreed to do this, the work of the UN framework deals with greenhouse gas emissions, mitigation, adaptation, and financial issues. That was adopted back in 2015. And of course, you remember what happened in 2016 when Trump said, no, we're not going to do that. The start was planned for 2020, signed by 125 nations, and ratified by 144. And the implementation implications were, if you implement all the things that the UN IPCC scientists said we should do, what would be the effect? We could prevent 0.30 degrees Fahrenheit of global warming by 2100 if we spent trillions, some estimate 132, but that keeps on increasing, trillions and trillions of dollars. We would have almost no effect on spending that kind of money. And of course, you can see what's happening over in Europe where they're trying to go to net zero. What's it doing to their economy? I mean, it does not work. Issue number 8, and this is the biggie because this is what got me started on looking at this. The UN IPCC climate models are not realistic. And this is one that I like to use because the UN IPCC have come up with more than 100 different models, and the models make assumptions, and the assumptions are different for every model. And if the model was accurate, then we would observe that we're matching those observations. But observations, okay, from 1975 to 2020. So here, first of all, the circles, these are actual measurements by balloons. We did measure temperature by balloons, and that's fairly accurate, but satellites are better. And then the squares, the blue, and some other. But the issue is these observations are nowhere clear to the average. All of these different, more than 100 models are way above what we actually see. So their models don't seem to be right, and that's why it got me into this. So surface weather stations, people have realized they give less accurate measurements than satellite and even balloons. What that urban effect is, let's say you create a thermometer weather station there measuring the temperature at different times. It's in the rural area, and then over time the urban sprawl takes over, and it's part of the urban sprawl. And because we have cement and pavement, it is much hotter by a few degrees. So if you're still using this same temperature measurement, you're going to get the wrong answer. And this here shows the satellite-based temperature, which has been done now for 45 years. From 1979, the blue line is the actual average temperature for each month. You can see it's from minus 0.4 degrees centigrade, and here we're about plus 0.4, 0.3 here. So yes, it has been increasing for those 50 plus years slightly, but it's not in the danger range at all. You may have heard Gore say, we're not going to have any polar bears if we don't do something about this. Well, at the time he said that, there were 5,000 polar bears. Today we have 25,000 or 30,000 polar bears. So it's just one of his projections that wasn't quite right. Another warning is that the sea levels would rise as fast as predicted. Well, we are able to measure sea levels pretty carefully, And the change is very, very small over, it's like 1.43 millimeters per year, hardly measurable at all. And you can see, yes, it is increasing, but from 1840 till today, 2020, very, very slight, nothing there. And the green line shows you the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. And so, yes, it has increased significantly here from 300 something to 400, but the surface or the sea level is not impacted by that at all. Number 12, the Arctic sea ice will disappear. Well, it made some measurements in 2013, and look at that, the size of that ice cap. It is in fact bigger in the same month as the one that was measured in 2012. So it's not disappearing. Yes, it might come down for a while, it might go up, but at the same time, it's not disappearing. Okay, and then the big thing is here, weather extremes, okay? There have been about 8 or 10 different projections made by the UN IPCC scientists, and these are things that, look at how bad they're getting. Okay, well, let's look at what they're getting. So here, in terms of drought, we've got a curve going from 800 to 2,000 or more here, AD. The red ones are natural, and the blue ones are, red ones are drought, and the blue ones are water. Okay, and you'll see over time we've had natural, warm periods, and we have had cooler periods. So it is different. But today, we've got something here that is there's definitely man is alive and well on Earth, and there are some increases, but they're very, very small compared to some of the ones. So it's nothing that we should be worried about. Intense hurricanes since 1880 by decade. Okay, here's a curve, from that date, 1880 to today, and you'll see, yes, it's let's say 3 here, and then the next year it's up to 7. Well, yes, that's quite a variation. But if you put a line through the average, okay, it's still slightly downtrend. There's nothing. The additional CO2 is not causing the problem. The same thing with tornadoes, and these are the cyclones. Okay, and so they measure the non-severe and the severe are the red, and you can see again that is downtrending over time. Okay, and then people say, you've read the papers. We have a severe heat wave. Some of us have been through, particularly on the East Coast, and higher than they've ever seen in their lifetime. Well, they forget that back in 1930 we had a real heat wave when it really was hot. This was during the time of the Depression, of course. And then here, percentage of days over 100. Okay, that's another measurement. So you look at these reds. Well, again, 1930, that's where the peak was. And yet the atmospheric CO2, is increasing. And yet we don't see, this one going up like that at all. So another one, average percent of days over 95. U.S. forest fire burn acreage. You'll see this is going back to the, 1900s, 1960. Yes, we had a lot of acreage burned, okay? But here, we're definitely lower than the peaks back here. So we're doing a better job of controlling wildfires than we used to, but yes, there's some bad ones here. So, but the UN IPCC will never show you this figure. Okay, they show you this part here. Okay, from 1983, 84 to today. So look at the curve up here. Look at that. This is from 1983, a level of 2, and then the peak is at 10. So look at the amount of burned areas is increased by a factor of 5, they would say. So we better do something about it. But they forget the past. I mean, it's not worse than it was. It goes through cycles. And here's another one, the Arctic sea ice extent. Yes, there are times during it's seasonal. Okay, sometimes during the year, they're not as thick as other times. And yet, if you look at all these years from 2005 to 2022, yes, they're different, but they're within a very small range. So this is not an issue. And the same thing for weather and climate disasters. Number 14, and this is one that people don't pay attention to, and that's why they focus on CO2 and not on water vapor, because water vapor is a natural force. CO2, yes, we are impacted. So the UN Charter limits the work of the committee to identifying only human causes of global warming, not natural causes, human causes. That's what their charter says, okay? And you can read it here. From the outset has been to assess on a comprehensive, objective, open, and transparent basis the scientific, technical, and socioeconomic information relevant to understanding the scientific basis of risk of human-induced climate change, its potential impacts and options for adaptation and mitigation. So their emphasis, their job is to look for human causes of warming. Well, why is that? Here's a surprising one. The UN IPCC officials admit that its real agenda is to redistribute wealth. In other words, follow the money. Okay, here's one of them here. Here's what he said. We redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy. One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with environmental policy anymore. That's what he had just said. So imagine redistribution of wealth, a world where people believe that the temperature of the planet can be controlled by giving more money to the government. So there's money behind this. Okay, number 16, you may have heard this percentage kicked around. 90% consensus of scientists is bogus. First of all, we have to realize that science and consensus is not the same thing. Consensus is not science. Consensus is, most of us believe this to be true, but in science, you said you have to use the scientific method to show that it's true. And so you have to be very wary of what they try to tell you. So here's an example of one survey. Surveys were sent out to 10,000 people. The surveys that they received back was 3,000, and then they narrowed it down to only the 77 climate scientists in that survey. It said that 75 of those climate scientists answered yes to question number 2. There are only 2 questions in the survey, and one of them is temperature increasing? And I'd have to say yes, it's increasing. But then the other is how significant is it? And that's a subjective number. So they take this 75 divide by 77 and come up with 97% of the scientists have a consensus that this is a problem. Okay, so now getting benefits of warming and more CO2. Okay, first of all, we do have fewer natural disasters. So for one thing, it saves lives. I'm going to show you charts that. Okay, so here, the death rate, it can be measured from natural disasters, and you can see there's wide variations, and in fact, it is coming down over time. And this one here shows the climate-related deaths. Okay, from this period, from 1920 to 2023, 100 years, it has come down quite a bit. So here is the charts that they play with. And the blue here is coal deaths, people that die through cold weather. And then the other part is heat deaths. In other words, a heat wave or whatever you have, the cause is heat. So you can see definitely more people die by cold than by heat. But if you read the fine print, this one here, the cold goes from 0 to 250. This one goes from 0 to 50. So the scales are different. So it may look like there's a lot of people dying from hot, but not really. Okay, and then, so what it really is this curve here. If you use the same scale, 0 to 250 and 0 to 250, nobody dies from heat waves. Well, there are people that do, but not in huge numbers that they say. Okay, so I'm coming up to another section here. Maybe this would be a good place to take a break.
Yes, very interesting. I want to look again at that quote by the...
Here. Okay, please welcome Heinz back up.
Okay, well, thank you. By the way, I do have some business cards that point you to all the different talks I have. I'll leave them there. You can pick one up if you like. So we're going through this, benefits of warming and more CO2 in the atmosphere, and I've gone through this part here, and this here. We also, turns out, we have increasing precipitation, and of course that helps plant growth. And this is, how plants make use of that, make use of extra CO2. And you wouldn't know this unless you looked at the science behind it, because more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, they need less water if there's more CO2. And more CO2 suppresses harmful photospiration. Now here's just one example from 1867 to today's date. With the atmospheric CO2 increasing, this is the blue line. I mean, we're a little higher now. We're over 420, but you'll notice that the yield, corn yield, per bushel per acre has increased significantly over that time as CO2 has increased here. And there's a number of curves here I have on this presentation. I'm not going to go through all the details, but you can see all those curves of yields of growth of food is increasing. And this is one I showed at the beginning, but it's still very valid. The more CO2 you have in the atmosphere, the taller your plants will grow and they'll produce more. And so we also have an increased growing season and a greening planet. And the longer growing season, of course, it allows your garden to be green and produce products for a longer period of time. And let's see, here's a good one here. This is the over a period of number of years. The green, the colors here, the green, the darker the green, the more the production of and the area of the planet Earth that can grow vegetables and other products. The more you have CO2, the more it can grow. So summarizing, we looked at some of the disasters that had happened. We looked at global warming actually saves lives rather than allows people to die from cold and all that. There's declining droughts. reduced wildfires if we handle that properly, increased food production, a greener planet, and I showed you a chart of the CO2 saturation. In other words, after so much CO2 in the atmosphere, if you add an equal amount, it gets less and less effective. So more CO2 has a lot of good benefits. And people that have studied, how do you deal with the hotter temperatures? You can either adapt to it, or you can mitigate it. In other words, take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And that is a very expensive effort. And that, to me, that is a no-op. It just doesn't do anything. So now I want to introduce the CO2 Coalition. Remember, the UN IPCC, and then we had the NIPCC. Now we also have a new organization called the CO2 Coalition. And I'm going to talk about a few major updates to what we have seen over the last few months in the discussion on global warming and climate change. This coalition was established in 2015 for the purpose of educating thought leaders, policymakers, and the public about the important contribution made by carbon dioxide to our lives and the economy. So they can see the benefits of CO2, and so they're promoting that. And the members of that, there are some very powerful members of some of these names you will recognize. In fact, even Patrick Moore, who is a co-founder of Greenpeace, is a member of the CO2 Coalition. I think there's a little over 200 PhD scientists in this organization at this point, so they know what they're talking about. William Happer he was an advisor to Trump for a long time. He also has a PhD in physics from Princeton. John Clauser, a more recent one, he actually won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2022. And so he's got a doctorate in physics. Greg Whitestone, the executive director, Richard Lindzen from Harvard, and Roy Spencer, who has a PhD in meteorology and is actually the one that produced these satellite measurements in the atmosphere. And he's a very strong believer, by the way, and he thinks like we do on that. And even got a Dutch scientist, William van Wijngaarden, PhD in physics. So many of these are physicists, and they have a lot to say. So one of the last sections I'm going to show you is what do the experts say about this. So some summary facts which I think we have covered. Clouds, water vapor is the main greenhouse gas driver. It is what controls the average temperature of the Earth. It's as much as 75 to 90% the driver. CO2, something like anywhere between 5 and 20%, and then methane happens to be about 10% of what the effect of CO2. Remember what they did with cows in Europe. They're trying to get rid of the methane. Well, it's pointless. That has almost no effect on temperature. Nitrous oxide, which is also a small greenhouse gas, and it's good for fertilizers. So they're natural drivers. The IPCC focuses on the 5 greenhouse gases, but there are other drivers of climate change. And the major one is clouds, water vapor, and cosmic rays and clouds formation, the interaction between those, and total solar irradiation, solar activity, climate cycles, ocean cycles, because oceans cover 70% of the Earth, and they're very deep. So they have a lot to say about the stability of the temperature. And then there is volcanic activity, and that will impact the climate as well. And large volcanoes can impact it in a large way for a number of years. And the other big thing about feedbacks in the models Many of the models that the UN IPCC uses assume positive feedback. In other words, the more carbon dioxide you put in, it interacts with the water, and it'll get stronger and stronger, and eventually we're going to have a breaking point. Well, that's not true. Okay, so now recent updates. Okay, this is news from April. Now, I'm going to explain what I mean by RCP in a bit, but that was one of the top models used by the UN IPCC to get their message across. Well, in last few months, it is now officially dead. They have agreed that there's no way that model is going to be achieved. Even Gore and Gates are shifting their view on global warming because, after all, because they were pushing net zero. However, now with the move in the industry to artificial intelligence and data centers, which require huge amounts of energy, you're not going to get that with the newbies, the new energy sources. It's just not going to do it, and they realize it. Gore and Gates are starting to realize that. So here's the first big one. The IPCC admits that the apocalyptic climate scenarios are implausible. They're not going to happen. There's another scientist who agrees with us on that. He always pointed out that this can never happen. It's impossible. And that's why that huge curve up by 2100, we're not going to get there on that model. And so since then, also 46 IPCC scientists have broken ranks and publicly challenged the dogmatic climate claims made by the UN IPCC. And by now, 1,900 scientists say global warming or climate change is not caused mostly by CO2. That's not the driver. Okay, and then the number two item I'm going to point to you is the NASA's models, and these are really the UN IPCC models, wildly underestimate the capacity of clouds to alter solar radiation. In other words, clouds have the biggest impact on the climate of all the greenhouse gases. So this one, the RCP, big issue, it's been buried. Doomsday model, RCP 8.5, dead and buried. Quiet but profound shift in climate science, and the long run of RCP 8.5 is dead. Okay, the worst model is not going to be achieved. They've agreed that. So what do I mean by that? Well, RCP stands for Representative Concentration Pathways. These are different models that I've picked here. This one here, which projected the largest increase, of the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere by the end of this century. Okay, all the way up to 1,200, when we're just above 400 now. It's not going to happen, and so they've agreed that that's not going to happen. And then if you look at the other models, are just selectively, what they've agreed is that this SSP5, 8.5, this SSP3, 7.0, and these heroines, these dotted lines, they're not going to happen. The new direction, we agreed, is more level. In other words, a gradual change up and down, but no big jerk back up. So this changes the whole picture in projections, okay? And these are just selected ones of those 100 models that I showed before, but they do not project the future. The ones down here, the lower ones, they project what's going to happen. And so this is a chart put out by a friendly climate change organization. And here's what they say about all those models. Okay, the tall one here, the worst case 8.5, it's not going to happen. The 3, 7.0, this one, it's not going to happen. And these other ones here are more likely to happen, and you'll see some of them are negative, and some of them don't rise very quickly. So this is the probability. This one here, group here, it's unlikely. It's just not going to happen. And this one here, very unlikely. And these here, last three, which are weaker models, they're much closer to what is actually observed. So there's a lot to determine yet. Some of these things are very difficult to measure, and that's why it's so controversial. Okay, and so this again shows you temperature or climate change models, different models, but then the three at the right, this is where we're actually at. Okay, so you can see all the models, do not match the observations. So, and then these are just some more numbers. I mean, the different scenarios. We talked about the 8.5, 7.0. The strength of those, and the expected temperature increase. 8.5 end up at 3.9 at the end of 2100, but that's not going to happen. This 7.0, this high one, they're not going to happen. The more likely ones are the ones that, between 1 and 2 degrees centigrade, if we really do get that much CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, so the bad guys are gone, and the fight is now in the smaller ones. Okay, the second one here, and this is going to be harder for you to understand because there's a lot of science behind it, but the clouds, the water vapor in the clouds, their effect on Earth's radiation, they have a lot more effect on the Earth's radiation than previously thought. So remember, this is the chart we're working from. All the energy comes from the sun. Some of it is reflected in clouds, some high clouds, some low clouds, and some from the Earth itself, all these yellow lines here. And the rest of it is the other 70%. That is radiation that is not visible, but that contains the heat, outgoing long-wave radiation. So that's the point is that these percentages need to be at a stable level, and eventually they are. They adjust up or down to get to be stable. Here's again the effect of the water clouds. Okay, they reflect upwards, and that is, the energy comes from the sun. They reflect upwards, and the percentage there is actually 30%. Scientifically, you can measure that. And so you got infrared heat reflected down, sunlight back up, and the trace gases, the other trace gases, they absorb and re-radiate in all directions, so they behave differently from clouds. Okay, NASA's models, this is this article that I just came across last week. NASA's models wildly underestimate the capacity of the clouds to alter solar radiation. So this is something that the UN IPCC models will not want to look at, but it has a very significant ability to make a change. So clouds are the largest moderator of Earth's radiation budget. NASA's models, they have a capacity to alter the solar radiation. Okay, and so the numbers are so off that the net is, this is 94 times larger than the 10 years of accumulated clear sky if you assume the clear sky with only CO2 impacts. So today's models must be improved a lot in order to match observations. And another big difference between the UN IPCC and the CO2 coalitions and the NIPCC, we assume that there are negative feedbacks. IPCC assumes that most feedbacks are positive. In other words, if you add more water and things to the clouds, it's going to eventually, there's going to be a tipping point, okay, because of the positive feedback. But actually, there is negative feedback, and that is also very difficult to measure, and that's why there's so much variation on people's thoughts on there. This one here, I don't know if you can see much. Well, it's got the 5 major greenhouse gases, methane, nitrous oxide, CO2 warming, above 420, and you see the yellow line. This is the contribution of carbon dioxide. Okay, so it gets very small the further and further you get out. But this large green one, okay, that is the existing impact of clouds and water vapor. And a small one is methane. Okay, you'll see on the scale here, 0 to 35. Well, 35 degrees centigrade is the amount that all greenhouse gases contributed to keeping us warm. So that's a total of, it turns out, 59 degrees Fahrenheit is due to the greenhouse gases. In other words, if there were no greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, we would be 59 degrees Fahrenheit lower than we are today. So greenhouse gases are necessary, and it depends on how they go up and down as what our climate is. Let's see, I showed you this one before, and I'm not going to take the time to go through that. So I'm going to get right to what do the experts say. And I'm taking the names of mostly of other physicists, what they are saying. Okay, here's William Happer, who is an advisor to Trump. He said, more CO2 actually benefits the world. It's not a pollutant at all, and we should have the courage to do nothing about CO2 emissions. So he's very strong on this. His view is that basic science shows increasing levels of CO2, nitrous oxide, and methane will not cause a climate emergency. This is another extraordinary popular delusion and madness of crowds, the sad history of human lust for money, power, folly, and cowardice. That's a science. He's a scientist, okay, and that's how he sees it. More CO2 will benefit life on Earth because it's valued to agriculture. More nitrous oxide and methane will have negligible effects on the Earth's climate. And rational people need to push back against climate finesse, which is not based on science at all. Appeasement will not work. Okay, here's another statement. Let's see. Well, again, by Dr. William Happer, you know where he stands. Policies to address this phony climate emergency will cause great damage to American citizens and to their environment. Okay, so people that treat climate change as an emergency, it's going to, ruin the economy of the country that they're in. We already see that in Europe, where many of the countries are sold on net zero. And net zero cannot happen, and so they're sometimes I'm saying that they're committing economic suicide by doing that. Okay, so more William Happer. It keeps the Earth's surface temperature warmer than it would be by about 20-30 degrees centigrade, or up to 55 Fahrenheit. And when I say water vapor, you should understand I really mean water vapor in clouds, the condensed form of water. Clouds are at least as important as greenhouse gases, and they are very poorly understood in this day. Okay, he would say, and others would say, climate regulations are based on a hoax. 2 prominent climate scientists have taken on the EPA new rules to cut CO2 emissions in electricity generation, arguing that regulations will be disastrous for the country for no scientifically justified reason. And that's, again, William Happer and Richard Lindzen. Both of them are physicists and climate scientists. The scientific method proves there is no risk that fossil fuels and carbon dioxide will cause catastrophic warming and extreme weather. And then here comes an interesting, Steve Koonin. He used to be in Obama's administration, but he wrote a book on climate change, and here's what he has to say about the models. So he shows that 73 models overestimate the warming of the globe. These models are the ones cited by the UN IPCC and its collaborators as proof of human-caused global warming. One problem that Koonin discussed is the failure of the models to correctly forecast clouds and temperatures. So natural fluctuations in the height and coverage of clouds have at least as much of an impact on the flows of sunlight and heat as do human influences. But how can we possibly know global cloud coverage, say 10, let alone 50 years from now? We can't say. We just can't. But to credit a climate model, we have to make assumptions. That's a pretty shaky foundation on which to transform the world's economy, because there are a lot of unknowns in this science. And one example he gives in his book, Steve Koonin, as I said, he was a former undersecretary for science in the Obama administration. And after his experience there, he wrote this book. And I picked this chart because this shows a lot of the problems that they have. So these are human and natural influences on climate. Human-caused CO2 means some small amount of CO2, 3.3%, say, of all the CO2 that's emitted into the atmosphere is due to human causes. And other greenhouse gases exert some warming influence. Human-caused aerosols, changes in land albedo, that's the amount of energy reflected off by the clouds, 30%, exert a cooling influence. So the more you bounce off the clouds, you're going to have a cooling influence. And I told some people here that there's actually talk in the government now of building a mirror to reflect the heat from the sun, bounce it back so the albedo gets stronger, but they'll never do that. Mirror can never be large enough. But anyway, so and natural cooling by volcano eruptions. So if eruptions have caused, like the one in Mount St. Helens and bigger ones in the world. And so with these two things, these are a chart here with points over time. It's from 1850 to 2010. The uncertainty in these here is 20%. Okay, so those points on there, they may not be accurate. They could be off, up or down by 20%, and one of them can be off by up to 50%. So if there's so much uncertainty in those measurements, how do you get the science models right? The models that we have now are not correct. Okay, so now statements by other different scientists. Here's a Dutch scientist. He says, there's no climate crisis due to greenhouse gases. CO2 is harmless, beneficial, causes global greening, increased agricultural production, essential for feeding growing world population. Net zero goals are unnecessary, impossible, and economically harmful. Renewables and their necessary backup are unsuitable to provide a growing world population with the reliable, affordable energy required to live in some comfort. And the other part is, what does he suggest and said? Well, nuclear energy and small nuclear energy sites are being built today to test that out. And that's the only place to get real inexpensive energy in the long run. So here's Dr. John Clauser, and he's the one that has the Nobel laureate in physics 2022. What does he have to say? Well, climate change science climate initiatives, society in general, case, greenhouse gas science is wrong. Clouds are the climate thermostat. In other words, the clouds is what controls the climate. And if some things that are part of that increase, that's fine. There's negative feedbacks which will bring it back down. And if it gets too low, it'll bounce back up. So it's a thermostat. So he sees the clouds as a thermostat. This post here provides a synopsis of his presentation done last May. Below are the text from his slides. So the IPCC greenhouse gas science is flawed and untrustworthy. Clouds are the thermostat for Earth's climate, not greenhouse gases, the other ones. So he confidently asserts that the climate crisis is a colossal trillion-dollar hoax. Very strong statement by a physicist with a Nobel laureate. So with those examples, people are saying we got to get to net zero. Well, over time, 1900. Most of our energy came from coal, and it's still coming from coal, and more from oil and gas. And according to the UN IPCC, we need to bring that down to zero by 2050. Now, if it's growing like this and it's still growing, how are you going to get that down? You can't. It's impossible. So then, in conclusion, the UN IPCC models have failed us miserably. They just don't work. Man-made causes are insufficient. Carbon dioxide and methane components of the greenhouse gas have very small effect, especially methane, very, very small effect. Natural causes, which we went over, of climate change are more credible. The sun's energy alone, what you get from the sun, is insufficient. It requires some interaction, like with the cosmic rays and sunspots. This can explain climate change. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And this is the one that was favored by Dr. Larry Vardaman, who used to be vice president of ICR, Institute of Christian Research. And then the Pacific decadal oscillations, the oscillations in the oceans, those are, they really do impact the climate change. And after all, it covers 70% of the world of our planet, so that's no surprise. And as I said before, the Paris Climate Agreement is not a solution for a non-existent problem. In other words, I would say we don't have a crisis, and why do we need a solution? So clouds are the thermostat for Earth's climate, not the greenhouse gases. So, and we saw more benefits of warming with the more CO2 that we have in the atmosphere. So what is the news media not telling you? Well, global warming from 78 to 98 has been replaced by global cooling. In other words, yes, there was warming after 78 up to 98, and then it started to level off for a while. And you saw the projection by NASA that the sun cycles are lower, getting lower and lower. So we are possibly entering into a cooling phase. So the Antarctic ice sheet is growing, not melting. Sea level is rising at 7 inches per century, not 20 feet, as the UN IPCC would say, or at least Gore would say. Some snowfall records set in the past 10 years. CO2 and methane cannot cause much global warming. Clouds, sun cycles, ocean currents, volcanoes, these are all natural causes. We don't control them. So they can and do control climate change, not CO2. Severe storms, as you saw by the charts I showed you, are not more frequent than normal. And so the other reason secular scientists think the Earth's climate is unstable, well, first of all, they have faulty climate models. They just don't work. And then also between the UN IPCC and the CO2 Coalition, UN IPCC thinks that most feedbacks are positive. In other words, the more we do, the worse it'll get. And the CO2 coalition people think that most of the feedback is negative. So if it goes too high, it'll come back down. So it's designed to modify within a certain range. Temperature follows CO2 by a few hundred years. Now, people would say, the UN IPCC models are based on the fact that the CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere. And that they would say that's because and that forces the temperature to go higher. But there's also some, in past history, there's some examples of the temperature actually following CO2. CO2 being coming out of the ocean waters, for example, that would cause the temperature to increase. So there's the other problem they have, fraudulent, politicized research, the use of surface measurements rather than satellite temperature measurements. I mean, these are much more effective, the satellite ones. Sometimes they cherry pick the data, as I showed you, from temperature stations in urban island situations. They have to be accounted for. And in some cases, I didn't show you here, but there's some cases where the data has been manipulated, and then the dependence on some other theory. So what should we as a church do about global warming? Well, we need to commit in general to viewing the world from God's perspective. We need to understand and rely on Scripture as a foundation for life. I mentioned this at the beginning, Genesis 8:22. All of our seasons will still be here in the future. And then use the Bible to understand the world and evaluate it, all the problems. Help inform other believers, promote the truth, oppose false beliefs with gentleness and respect. So the conclusion is climate change is not a crisis. Let's not panic. So,
Thank you very much.